Hello and welcome. When is enough? Our Western culture teaches us that if at first you don't succeed, try again. In fact, there's something noble about just pushing ahead. But when is it really enough? When do you know that you're not doing your life's mission, that it's preventing you from getting ahead? I'm Pat Kazakoff, and today I'm speaking to Dr. Robert Hamm. He's a psychologist in West Hartford Center, and he's an expert in all things psychological. Stay with me. Hello, Dr. Hamm.
All right, Pat.
So when is enough enough?
There's really no simple answer to that. It is virtue. We're all brought up in a culture that extols the virtues of hard work and to be ambitious, to do our best in life. There's a downside to that. But it's difficult to pinpoint exactly when it starts to surface, when problems arise, and so it can manifest itself in different ways.
So what are the typical manifestations? Like if I stay up till 1 a.m., 2 a.m. doing a project, the next morning I feel good. I feel good because I've accomplished my project.
Yeah. Well, coincidentally, this segment I had sent to you very late in the night. And so I think it's very pertinent to the process that I'm going through sometimes, not having enough time to get everything done sometimes. So, it is a virtue to work hard and work extra hours if necessary in order to reach our goals in life. However, when I stay up too late to get a project done, what's the downside of that, for example? Let's just look at the most simplest consequence. The next morning, we don't feel quite our most chipper, our most freshest, when there's a price to pay.
Right, but even though I'm not chipper, because I also stay up till 1, 2 a.m. doing what I need to do, I feel great that I accomplished this. And even though I'm a little tired, it's a small price to pay.
Well, then it might work for you. But in the long run, as a philosophy, I think it's important for us to consider when we are striving to reach our goals and we have certain expectations for us to meet some kind of goals or expectations on ourselves, that if we don't take a survey, if we don't pay attention to what our limitations are,
so how would I know what my limitations are? Because certainly staying up till 1 or 2 a.m. to complete something, that is not my limitation.
Well, everybody's different. I mean, it may be that you can get away with that, but just for the sake of argument and to answer your question, if we don't pay attention to what our limits are, what the costs are, whatever it is that we sign on with in order to reach our expectations in life, that will eventually come back to haunt us in one way or another.
So what are the typical ways that when people walk into your office that they present with that tells you it's enough already?
One way is the psychological effects on ourselves or on others. So with regard to the effects on ourselves, if our expectations are too high, some people are very hard on themselves. And so if they're perfectionistic, they can suffer from anxiety because they're on a treadmill and they're trying so hard, and their expectations sometimes creates an unrealistic demand on their time or on their performance. For example, I am working with a man who has an anxiety disorder, and the symptoms manifest when he is engaged in public speaking. Now, ordinarily he does very well, but every now and then he will have an anxiety attack in the middle of his talk.
And how will that express itself? Will people see that, or what happens?
They might, But of greater importance is that he's very self-conscious. So if he starts to feel that anxiety, he starts to notice that it's like his hands are shaking or his voice is a little quivery. And that makes him very self-conscious about, oh, people might see this, and I am going to be seen as a quack, as a phony. People will think I don't know what I'm talking about. And it probably, if it shows, I'm sure it isn't nearly to the degree that he feels. But we
See,
talked
I
about,
thought that quivering hands and sweating is normal. I didn't realize I'm supposed to take note of that.
Oh, okay.
That to me was normal.
Oh, is that right?
Well,
Okay.
that's what I thought.
Well,
Doesn't everybody quiver? Doesn't everybody get hot and clammy and their mouth gets dry?
Well, maybe you're right. I mean, you're a professional, so in this area. So perhaps I'm mistaken. But for many people, it makes them feel he feels self-conscious. But we talked about where this comes from and looked at his childhood and issues in his childhood in relation to his parents and feelings that he wasn't good enough and should have tried better. And so it could represent sort of a remnant from his childhood, this kind of perfectionistic demand of himself. So in helping him to understand that he's only human, and if he doesn't do a perfect job, that it's okay, and help him work through that while he's giving a talk, is tantamount to accepting one's limitations in life and finding humor and acceptance. And there, so
Is finding humor, is that a technique that you use? Like like when you work with somebody, you say find the humor in this. Is that a technique, or is that just something that a person does naturally?
So he's, this patient of mine, he's a very well-adjusted individual, but there's a part of him that has difficulty in accepting himself as, less than perfect. So in helping him to accept that and suggesting that he find humor in the situation or even share his experience in the moment when he's giving a talk will help him to relax and will make this anxiety attack, or actually it's more the fear of an anxiety attack that's more troublesome to him than anything else. This expectation, it will help it to go away.
So are you suggesting that in the middle of his talk, because you mentioned that he is a very well-adjusted person, but just in this particular situation, things go a little bit awry. Are you suggesting in the middle of his talk that he say to the people, oh, look, my hands are a little clammy. I'm a little nervous talking. Is that the suggestion?
Sort of. I mean, it doesn't have to be specifically that, but think about it. If you go to a play or you're watching the actors performing and they forget their lines or they screw something up, it's up to them to try to get back on their feet and kind of improvise rather than get sort of all nonplussed about the situation and tongue-tied. And in order to do that, you have to kind of accept what has happened rather than try to hide it or deny it. And so, this individual that is a patient of mine was fearful that it would be seen, and so his investment was in hiding these symptoms rather than accepting. Hiding for what purpose? Because his expectation, although he wasn't thinking of this consciously, I believe it was a subconscious process, with this fear he had that he had to be perfect, that he had to be seen, very concerned about how he appeared, for fear that they might see some chinks in his armor in one way. And that investment in that is what created the anxiety and the anticipation it might happen again at any time that he would be, not expecting it.
Do more men or more women have this syndrome? Is there some sort of statistical bias in this as far as this idea of perfection and nervous about being the best that you can be? Is it more female or male dominated, or no?
I don't think so. I mean, we all, regardless of gender, want to do our best. We want to appear to others as competent and can feel embarrassed if we're not at our best. I mean, that's just human nature.
And what about people who are trying very hard at something that's never going to happen. What about that?
Well, that's life, isn't it?
Well, most of the time you try at things that you have a chance of success, that a chance that it's within your realm. But what about people who are just working at something that's never going to happen? What
Yeah.
about those people?
Right. Well, again, I mean, that's life. That we all go through those experiences in one way or another. And if you don't accept that possibility, you're going to run into difficulties, aren't you? No matter how competent and no matter how hard you work, no matter how talented you are, even the people who are champions, who've won awards and have excelled, eventually will meet their limits in one way or another. If you're an athlete, there comes a time when you get too old and you have to hang up your cleats or whatever it is, because there are other people who are passing you by. So it's universal.
But how do you know? How do you know when this is it? Like, what tells you? What's a healthy way of knowing? Like you mentioned your patient. Your patient was quite healthy in that he identified that he had a problem, and he came to you to talk about it.
Right.
But most people, I don't know if they identify it.
Well, getting back to the analogy of the athlete, it's a sort of a common phenomenon that when should an athlete retire?
When he's 20.
For some people, maybe in football, Andrew Luck, for example, but it's difficult. And in order for someone to know that, they have to be aware of themselves, what their limits are. If you're in denial, that you're aging, that it's just a normal part of process. If you believe of life, if you believe that you're supposed to be the best forever, if you're not aware, of these realities of life and that limitations is a part of what it means to be human, you're going to have difficulties, and you're going to find that you're not up to your best in performance, so you're injuring yourself, or that you will lose your contract. So most of us would rather be aware and anticipate and plan for that. So it takes an awareness. And if you don't have that awareness, as with my patient with regard to this specific problems, then certain kinds of difficulties arise or symptoms that I believe that is the reason that he was having these anxiety attacks.
Are there some common symptoms that a person would make a person aware if they're not self-reflective?
Well, this goes back to your initial question. I mean, it can affect our relationship with ourselves, where we have difficulty we get too hard on ourselves, or our relations with others, when we become too harsh on others, when we expect things that are too perfectionistic or unrealistic, or it can affect us physically. So with my patient, the anxiety attacks, the physical manifestations, or can actually make us sick when we're overdoing it. We might be pushing ourselves in the gym and working too hard and end up injuring our neck, as I did in the gym the other day. So I could, I think I could benefit from applying some of this philosophy to myself sometimes.
What about, I've heard of a syndrome, the Nobel Prize syndrome. What's that all about?
Well, this is a concept that was introduced in the psychological literature years ago that I came across while I was researching for my doctoral dissertation. And it's an example of how some people have difficulty in accepting limitations. In order for us to be able to resolve these difficulties in knowing when is it time to accept our limits and when is it time to desist from trying. If you believe that you have to be the best, you have to win the Nobel Prize, you have to be stellar at everything you do, you're not going to be able to see, you're not going to be able to hear from others, you're not going to be able to discern in life those situations where you're up against the limitations of your abilities, the limitations of life, and it is necessary in order to be able to understand when these limitations occur, in order for us to be able to make adjustments. Without making adjustments, we don't evolve. We don't evolve. We continue to keep hammering away persistently, perseveratively, to our own detriment.
And that hinders you from your life's mission, for what you're supposed to be really doing to get ahead.
Yeah, certainly.
Yeah.
You know? So if our mission, let's say, I want to be let's say an NFL football player. You know, how many people, get into the NFL?
Not a lot.
Very few.
Right.
But there are a lot of kids out there who aspire to that. They're athletes in school, and even if they're good, and even if they're number one on their team, the likelihood. So yes, it's good to have those ambitions, and maybe you will. And I'm not saying that you shouldn't strive for it, but you also have to have a plan B in mind. You have to have a backup. When your goals are so high, such as becoming a professional athlete, there has to be an understanding that reality doesn't allow most people to reach that goal, however ambitious they may be, however hard they may be working towards.
What
that.
about the syndrome? I think Karen Horner described it.
Horney.
What's the name?
Horney.
Horney. Karen Horney described it in the literature, that the person who wants to get on top of the mountain, but he doesn't want to climb. What is that all about? I mean, I see that a lot in the millennial thinking, that kind of feeling. I want to be here, but I don't want to do the work that it takes to go here.
Right.
What's that?
Well, that is like the Nobel Prize complex. So Karen Horney, who was a psychoanalyst back in the early to mid 20th century, was particularly interested in what she identified as the idealized image. She found that many of her patients suffered from this kind of syndrome, if you will, where they believed, for whatever reason, she believed because they had difficulties in childhood, in how they were raised, as she did in her personal life.
It seems that everybody has difficulties in childhood. Everything seems to stem from there.
Yeah, that's
a lot?
true. Well, I mean, it's a cliche, but there's a lot of truth to it. I mean, it's like a cartoon by Gary Larson. I don't know if you remember Gary Larson, a person who is sitting in an audience at a convention of people who were there from happy and well-adjusted families, and in the audience, in this big auditorium, there was just one person.
Okay, I get it. I understand it.
Right, yeah. So anyway, Dr. Horney saw this as one of the main difficulties and challenges many of her patients faced. Because of these difficulties in childhood, she believed that children growing into adulthood develop an idealized image of who they should be and identify with it. And if they don't meet those expectations, they deny reality, instead identify with an idealized self, which creates difficulties for them in life. And her work as a psychotherapist was devoted to helping them accept themselves for all of their facets, so their strengths as well as their limitations.
So is this syndrome much more common in the millennial era, or is that just my experience?
I'm not sure. I think that when you talk about the millennial era, I think that there are commonalities and probably differences from our generation. I think today, in the society that we live in, there are more difficulties in terms of our outlook, the prosperity of our society, the economics that we live in today.
Well, remember, those millennials, they were brought up by us.
Yeah, that's true.
We're the parents.
Right.
We're the parents.
Yes.
So we were brought up by the silent majority. Silent majority brought up us, and we brought up them, and we were all from the 60s. So somehow how did we transfer that idealized self to the millennial era? Like, what did we do?
I suppose in some instances that sort of outlook or that ideology got transferred and created additional problems for their children. But I think it is also the world that we live in, that there are fewer opportunities as there once were, and the outlook is less optimistic or idealistic than it used to be. And also, I mean, with the millennials, there is a common complaint that that there's a greater degree of emphasis on self-esteem, maybe too much emphasis on self-esteem or an entitlement. And so, to the extent that that's true, it can create problems with accepting ourselves, accepting limitations.
And also that sense of freedom, that sense of individualization. You can be and do whatever you want, and maybe you can't.
That's right, and that isn't to say that those aren't good virtues. They're vectors. They are things. They're ideologies that we are brought up with. That gives us, I think, the drive that we should in order to be successful in life. But if you go into adulthood with a sense of entitlement, you lose the sense of what grounds us with those limitations that we need to be cognizant of. We fail to recognize that in order to establish that freedom in life, that it's not an entitlement, but it entails responsibility. We have to look at ourselves and be accountable for whether or not we've given the effort and we have accepted our part in determining whether we are successful or not, rather than expecting it.
So now, given today, how can a parent contribute to a child's realistic idealization of themselves, as opposed to this unrealistic person that somehow we created with the help of the world?
Well, I think that there's two kinds of love that we psychologists are aware of. There's conditional and there's unconditional. And I think a good parent, it used to be called the mothering and fathering process in psychotherapy. The mothering being the unconditional love, and the fathering being the conditional. We don't have to assign gender to those differences. A good parent conveys to their children that they're loved no matter what. However, nonetheless, expectations are given to them that they should take responsibility in life because there are lessons to be learned. And so there is an element of conditional love as well.
And is that healthy? Is that something that we should project to our children, conditional and unconditional?
Yes.
Both are healthy.
I think that
in their place.
We need that balance in order to show children that regardless of whether they succeed or fail, if they make their best efforts, that they will be loved, but that they don't get a free pass in life. As they get older, they are expected to assume more responsibility, because our job as parents is to prepare children to meet the challenges of life.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Okay, well, I don't know how successful we've been at that. I'm not 100% sure.
Well, I guess we have to learn, again, back to our theme, to accept those limitations that we as parents, even though we may try our best, are not always going to be perfect.
And what about, I mentioned it before, about people who don't try, that they want to be at the top, but they don't try. They don't do anything it's sort of like a person, I would have been a great doctor, except I couldn't go to medical school. It was too much work. I mean, how is that syndrome balanced in life? Because that's something that repeats itself over and over again.
Yeah, so there was another psychoanalyst, his name was Alfred Adler, and he had a term, he called it the able but lazy ploy.
What's it called, the able?
The able but lazy ploy.
Okay.
So he found that in some of his patients had a sense of entitlement, that they preserve their idealized self-image by saying, well, I can do that, but I don't have to try. I know that I could. And it's a way of avoiding testing out what you're capable of doing and preserving self-esteem as a result. It doesn't work in life, obviously. You end up going through with a sense of entitlement, accomplishing nothing. And then eventually, as you get older, finding that all your cohorts are passing you by in life.
And so how does one treat a person with that kind of a syndrome? Like, what do you do?
Well, you have to impress on them the reality of their situation, that living by that philosophy becomes more and more destructive. It accumulates over time. So the longer you live by it, the more the world becomes separate from who you are, and the more you have to rely on sort of this delusion that, you're better than everybody else, but where's the evidence for it?
And eventually you get it.
You
come to terms.
But this is the task of the psychotherapist, to help them to understand that this is something that they've created. It's not the fault of society or their parents or whomever.
It's their problem.
Their problem that they have to assume responsibility for if they wanted to change.
I've been talking to Dr. Robert Hamm, and we've had a discussion about millennials and also what you have to do if you can't achieve your goals. It's not healthy to have unrealistic goals. It's not healthy to just go plowing ahead in something that's not going to happen. Dr. Robert Hamm, thank you very much. It's been very, very interesting, and you've given me a lot to think about also.
Well, thank you, Pat.